We're just going to have some questions to Karl and Phil. So if you can just pop your hand up if you'd like to ask a question. Naomi's just got some cards there, some numbered cards. She'll give you...
My name is Peter Bernard. The questions are directed to the two speakers. Number one, the first one on the insurance liability. I noticed a brief examination, and I'm not a legal person, that the insurance companies have stated on a lot of policies that if there is any increase in the sea level rise due to a storm surge from the mainland, the policy is not exempt. Could I have a comment on the and it doesn't cover the person that is affected. Now the second question who was the second one?
Phil?
Yeah. Now I noticed that in your presentation that there's a lot of circumstances that don't exist today. The 2009 sea level rise benchmarks, and in a recent you're calling for submissions from the public with regards to changes of notations on 149 certificates. It'll be interesting to notice that after a meeting with the Minister Parker and another minister and about 6 members of the planning department, it was stated that after it was asked a question that most of the sea comes through Crown lands. Where does the legal liability lie with the government in rather than transferring all the responsibilities to the residents and the planners of all the councils along the Eurobodalla coast with regard to that aspect? The reply was that they didn't have any jurisdiction over that. So in other words, when the sea rises and it comes through most of the Crown land, which is probably 90% of the coast, who is responsible for any flood mitigation works and the protection of properties behind those that come from the coast or even up to the estuarine rivers?
Okay, thank you, sir. So we'll go to the panel. If you could just hand the mic back to, and the card back to Naomi, thanks. And we'll go to Karl first and then Phil. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Great question. So I think what you're asking about is exclusions around storm surge, particularly when a sea level rise might exacerbate that or make that worse. Storm surge is generally captured under the phrase actions of the sea. And if you read your policies, about 93% of people in here will find that actions of the sea or words similar to that are excluded from your policies. There are very, very few insurance policies that will offer you cover for that. So if you're living 1 metre above the sea level, and let's say 10 metres from the beach, and you clearly have a risk, some risk of storm surge, you're not going to be covered for it by most policies because most policies don't factor that into the premium. If they did, you could expect, if you were 1 metre above sea level and 10 metres from the beach, that your premium would probably go from there to about there. So it's generally not covered. There are a few insurance companies, though, that do cover some actions of the sea. For example, storm surge when there's been a cyclone, because they cover cyclone, and if the cyclone has caused the storm surge, they'll sometimes consider it. And tsunami as a action of the sea, they'll generally cover that because of its proximate cause being an earthquake. But in general, if an east coast low just came up the coast here right now, and there was a storm surge that affected everybody in this room, more than 90% of you would find that your insurance company points out the clause in your policy that says this is an action of the sea and this is excluded. The only thing that policies will cover in terms of inundation, almost universally, is stormwater or overland flow, and then flood. So stormwater or overland flow is water flowing towards the river or the ocean or a creek. Flood is water coming out of a river, a creek or a dam. So I'm not sure if that covers 100% of what you're asking, but in general, storm surge not covered.
And Karl, we go to Phil for the second.
Yeah, look, I'll try and address the second study. You must appreciate I don't work for the Department of Lands. That's a separate government division. But I think what you're inferring is that what responsibility does the New South Wales government have to protect its own land. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah. And lands adjacent to it. Well, I'm not sure. You received an answer from them that indicated they believed they didn't have any responsibility to do that. And the way in which the New South Wales government had managed Crown estates over many, many decades is smack bang on exactly with that there. They don't protect the Crown assets, they're erodible assets. However, what we try and do with coastal zone management plans is that we try and deal with that on an embayment basis, encapsulating all of the issues and all of the land managers, which includes Department of Lands as well.
Okay, thank you, Phil. I'm now going to go to the gentleman who had the green card number 2 for your question.
Thank you. I'm Peter Coggan. I live at Moral Bay. To both panel members, how does the New South Wales government expect local councils to pay for, one, research for the building of these policies, and two, the ongoing costs to councils and probably ratepayers, especially in regard to compensation to landholders for, and ratepayers for loss of property values. In other words, the hot potato has been passed directly to councils. Now, is there any provision for grants to the state government, or we paying the bill ourselves to the detriment of our sort of infrastructure such as roads, bridges, etc. Now, I don't think this is a fair go for the ratepayers in Europe. Can you comment on that, please?
Karl, Phil, are you?
Yeah, look, obviously I'm not from the government, so that gives me a fair bit of leeway in what I can say here, but it's a great point, because doing these studies and all of this work is very expensive, and somebody has to pay for that, and if the council's going to be required to do it, where are they going to get the money from everybody here? One of the things that I've noticed that has changed very recently, though, the change in federal governments has brought a different focus on mitigation compared to post-disaster payout. So if you think back to 2011, the big floods in Queensland, where everybody got hit with a tax, or most people got hit with a tax to help pay for all the damage up there. There was announced today the start of a Productivity Commission inquiry to look at why are we doing that. Let's flip the funding around so that we make more money available for local councils to do the studies and do the work and do the mitigation and get it right, so that when the disaster happens, not as many people are affected and we don't have to pay out as much. So my sense of it is that is changing, but that will take time. But I think you're quite right. There is a heavy obligation on local councils, not just in New South Wales, but all around the country, to do this work. And often they don't have the resources or the technical prowess, and they've got to rely on outside agencies and consultants to do it, and that comes with big price tags.
Look, one thing I'd just like to point out, the state government up until 1990, with the release of the Coastal Hazards Policy, was providing 100% funding for coastal protection works in New South Wales. And we've always funded the data collection under MHL contracts. I mean, that amounts to tens and tens of millions of dollars. Since 1990, I think we've invested on a 1:1 partnership basis approximately in excess of $50 million to do all of the studies and the implementation works as well pertaining to coastal zone management. So, I mean, the 100% funding model up until 1990 was obviously not sustainable. For two reasons. One was financially, the other was socially, in that councils were perceiving that the state was imposing its will on various coastal communities because it was funding everything 100%. So we moved to a partnership model from 1990 onwards, where we facilitate all of the work that's being done and provide the 50-50 funding. And that's directed by local government.
Thanks, Phil. I'm going to go to question number 3. Who had question 3? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Brian Kimmings. I've got a question for both the speakers. First to Mr. Sullivan. In your presentation, you showed a flood map of Ballina and referred to the fact that it appeared that the insurance industry is reliant upon flood risk plans produced by local councils. You mentioned that if there hadn't been that plan, then the premiums would be higher across the board rather than selected based on a risk assessment. Given that a lot of these plans are now based on, or seem to be based on, as it were, doom and gloom predictions, based on unscientific data, which is not evidence-based and possibly has been discredited. And given that, as Mr. Watson said, the previous New South Wales government benchmarks have been removed as being not, as it were, appropriate to use as a basis, I just ask, from the insurance industry's point of view, do you make your own assessment of risk, or do you just blindly accept whatever flood plan the local council has done? That's my question to Mr. Sullivan. To Mr. Watson, my question is, I noticed in your presentation, at no stage did you mention anything about there being a requirement for evidence-based risk assessment to be undertaken by councils. Now, in the, I think it was the circular about Section 149 certificates, there's, as it were, in the guidelines, it suggests to councils that they need to take this approach. But it would seem that some councils, if they want, can, as it were, thumb their noses at the government and just say, well, we're still doing a risk assessment in accordance with the objectives, in accordance with the acts. The fact that we may be relying upon, predictions based on unscientific data or not evidence-based, that's our problem. Is it possible for the government to be a bit more forceful in requiring all councils to take this evidence-based approach? Thank you.
First to Karl, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really good question. We're quite often presented with maps from local councils that are annotated as flooding a la 2050 and 2100. So they've incorporated, in Rabbitty's climate change factor. We take those and throw them over the left-hand shoulder. They're no good to us because we're only interested in the risk as predicted today. We're not insuring you for in 50 years' time or 100 years' time. So where a council presents us with that, we say, look, we can't use it. And there's not been a single exception to that. It is becoming more and more common that that's the only thing we're presented with, because there has been a reasonable amount of government funding given to, over the last decade, climate change mapping and predictions and that kind of work. Unfortunately for the insurance industry, it doesn't help us calculate your risk today. But I guess more globally, you were asking, do we only rely on what the council gives us? Yeah, that's it. We have a starting point where we know where all the floodplains in Australia are, and that's something we use as a red flagging measure. But when it comes to calculating the flood risk at your location, we can only rely on what the local council has provided here in New South Wales. And if they haven't provided something, or they've only provided something that's for 50 years' time, we've got no information to go on, except that you're maybe 1,000 metres away from a major river or the coastline or something like that. So we discard that information, which is unfortunate. We don't have a process where we can unpick out the climate change factor. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Karl. Now, Phil.
Look, just to allay your fears, I mean, when all the councils undertake these hazard definition studies or coastal studies, most of those are reviewed by our agency, its technical staff, and at the end of the day, a lot of those come to me to provide a sign-off on those things. So I've got to be able to demonstrate that what the council's doing meets industry best practice standards, and Mr. won't certify any plans otherwise.
Yeah, we can We'll go to the last question that we've got time for in this session, remembering that we've got 2 more Q&A sessions still to come later in the day. Thank you, sir.
I'm Paul Gross, and I'd also like to ask Paul Watson a question about setting benchmarks. As I heard you, what you said was that last time around you did it, in your guidelines, the benchmarks you set were not properly construed, presumably in the legislation and in their application. Would you mind telling us, you've got the task ahead of you to upgrade these guidelines shortly, in the light of what's happening now with the new policy. Would you mind telling us what your new approach might be to avoid that problem? And secondly, one of the glaring faults with your benchmarks is that councils don't get any guidance on anything other than the science. Have you any intention, or are you under any pressure to provide benchmarks on how to do proper economic and social assessment of the impact of the sorts of policies that councils are imposing? And in particular, are you aware, and do you intend to take notice of, the standard that the state government sets itself through the Subordinate Legislation Act as to how these sorts of economic and social and scientific assessments have to be done in regulation?
Thank you.
Thanks for that. That sounded like 50 questions, but I'll try and work my way through it. One of the, I guess just to clarify the benchmarks, I mean, when in 2009 we were the last state to actually advocate the use of any consistent sea-level-rise benchmarks for anything, for strategic planning, whatever. Now, when they were adopted, I mean, I'm just one advisor in a whole Congo line of bureaucratic process. The thing that we advised at the time was to be very careful with putting out these benchmarks, because we need to follow that up with some contextual information on how to apply those benchmarks for strategic planning, for development assessment, for infrastructure designs and things like that there. And that supplementary follow-up information was never provided. So the reality was everybody was left to try and interpret that information as best they saw. Some councils were jacking up floor levels by 90 centimetres for a DA and saying, well, the government told us we had to do it. Now, that's just fanciful stuff. I mean, it's just simply not understanding what the intention of the original policy was. And again, as I said, and look, I'm trying to be quite open about that there, we should never have called them benchmarks. They weren't benchmarks. They were simply testing points that should have been considered as a course upper bound assessment of what the science was gearing towards over those planning horizons, and you need to consider that in some sort of a risk management framework. If you're considering a boat shed or a boat ramp or something like that, you probably don't even have to consider sea level rise at all. You just simply keep adapting that structure. But if you're putting a hospital within the coastal fringe, obviously that requires a much higher level of attention to things that are going to affect that structure and those sorts of assets over a longer planning horizon. And I think that that's where we need to move to with sea level rise and with government advice concerning how to actually apply and incorporate sea level rise into their strategic planning moving forward. It's that context that was missing last time around.
Okay, thank you very much, both Karl and Phil. So we're going to wind up the Q&A there. Karl's going to leave us now, so I'd like to thank you again for